I'd like to welcome you here to Politics in the Pub. My name's Mary and I'm on the Politics in the Pub committee. The topic that we have tonight is coal seam gas or fracking expanding throughout Australia. What must be done to stop this? The speakers tonight are Jeremy Buckingham, who is the New South Wales Greens MLC, and Paddy Manning, who is a journalist and the business editor of Frack and author of What the Frack.
I was writing coal, oil and gas on the business desk at the Sydney Morning Herald and for a couple of years there, and also wrote a column for a while at the Herald and the Age on sort of climate, green business stuff, and that's how I approached this. This topic was basically looking at the rise of unconventional oil and gas from a climate perspective, which was coming to understand over the last few years, as we all have, that just how urgent the climate challenge really is, where Australia's position is in that it's part of that global problem, and how deep the emissions cuts really need to be to get to something like, give us an even chance of 2 degrees, and that means, our fair share in Australia is 25% by 2020 at least. And so you start to look at the energy, the energy industry differently if you approach from that perspective. And coal seam gas is at a really interestingly positioned in that climate debate. So we have. I still don't think it's really dawned on most people yet that we're about to become the world's biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas. We're going to overtake Qatar. And we've got $200 billion worth of LNG export projects under construction in Australia, and the first of those are just starting to, they're going to ramp up. But they're ramping up. I mean, Pluto came online last year, and actually 2 years ago, and we've got basically it's happening in 2 areas. One is offshore WA and the Browse Basin and around there, Ichthus, the Japanese investing with the pipeline through to Darwin, and that's where we've traditionally had our gas exports from, the Northwest Shelf, etc. It's just it's up higher, massive spend, unbelievable. The Gorgon project itself was the last number I saw was $50 billion. That's by Chevron, and so it's an absolute huge boom, but it's in such a remote location. Of course, sitting here in Sydney, we never see any of it. And then on the east coast, and what's really a world first, is that Australia, in between 2010 and 2011, approved 3 massive new LNG export projects. And for the first time in the world, we were going to try and export LNG from produced from coal seam gas. So stop me if the acronyms get too thick, but LNG. There's a bit of jargon here. I'm no expert. I'm just a journo. But LNG, they build what are called liquefaction trains, and each train consumes, basically, to feed this train that produces super cold gas as a liquid into a tanker off to Japan or wherever. Each train basically has the same annual gas consumption as, say, the state of Victoria. So feeding these things is massively, they need a lot of gas. And they're building 6 of them up at Gladstone on a place called Curtis Island that I went to when I was researching the book. And I wasn't allowed on Curtis Island, but what happened was the Queensland government approved these within the space of a year and a half, and the federal government ticked off as well. It was an absolute rush. It was a rush job like we've probably never seen. It's still something that hasn't been properly investigated in a sense, and there's been journalists crawling all over it. You've probably seen the 4 Corners and 60 Minutes and everything. But it still is amazing. How did they get those approvals at that time with so many questions about this new technology it's new to Australia, and what impact it would have on our groundwater, what impact it would have from a climate perspective, what impact it would have socially and for land use, and particularly for farmers. Nevertheless, they would rush these approvals through, and Queensland is still dealing with the consequences. Those three projects make up worth, they're about, about ballpark $20 billion worth each. There's three companies behind it. One is it's called BG Group now. It used to be, they're a global oil and gas major. They bought a company called Queensland Gas, which is one of the first movers on coal seam gas in Queensland. The other one is Origin Energy, and the other one is Santos-led. And all of these have brought in big, gas off-takers from, Asia as joint venture partners, and they've all got the one builder, Bechtel, which is building the three, the 6 big trains right next to each other. Up there, and the first one is supposed to, they're all running late, they're all running over budget, and the first one's supposed to kick off next year. I think it was supposed to originally actually start up the BG Group from the end of this year. And when those things turn on, which will happen over then progressively 2 years, it's going to completely change the gas market on the East Coast. So we are all now already seeing gas prices, at a household level, business household, because there's a gas shortage. Suddenly, for the first time, the East Coast gas market, which is just, supplied ordinary, us, is now feeding Asia. And that's exposed the East Coast to what's called, export parity pricing. So, and that in turn is linked to the oil price. So, LNG has always traditionally been sold out of Australia, and the traditional customer is Japan. It's always been sold at a price that is, they call it a slope. It's a proportion, it's about 0.14% of the oil price, which turns out to be, 12 or 13 bucks a gigajoule. Actually, we've traditionally got 14, but it's coming down. And it's coming down under pressure because what's happened is the US as well has had an unconventional oil and gas boom. That's where the fracking technology came from. So, and they've got so much gas now, it's not coming from coal seam gas. Jeremy's been there, I've interviewed Jeremy in my book, but Jeremy can talk to you more about exactly how that boom is rolling out in the States than I can. But, and you might have all seen Gasland. It's a great film actually, it's very worth seeing. It's a cracking piece of film, but it's also a very well researched, despite the attacks on it, very well researched film, which I recommend you read, and then go to the website and read the rebuttal of the industry attacks that were made on the credibility of various things there. But yeah, so the boom started in 2005 in the US, and it's it's all broadly related to peak oil, and it started at 2005 in the US when they combined two technologies. One is hydraulic fracturing, which is an old. It has been around for decades, but it really took off at this point when the Bush government relaxed laws around water protection, and yeah, basically the fracking. What the frack is pumping huge amounts of water down to crack. Generally, in the US, it's shale beds that are about 3 kilometres down. You crack them and pull out the water that exists down, and the gas comes out as well. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is the ability to directionally drill. So you go down and drill down, and then you can follow, whether it's a coal seam underground or a shale bed or whatever, you can follow that around, and then you send your little drill string down, bends around a corner, and follows this seam along, and then you can pump the water down, and so that combination of technologies has opened up previously unaffordable gas reserves, enormous, and it's changed the energy equation globally. And we've imported this technology from the sort of late 90s into Queensland, and where they were really trying to encourage some alternative to coal, and then it's taken off in Queensland first as a result of that policy, and because they have good, they've got a lot of gas there. Do I need to distinguish coal seam gas from shale gas? Coal seam gas is generally shallower. I think it generally requires less fracking, and it generally comes with more produced water, and we have shale reserves in Australia out in the Cooper Basin, which is a traditional oil and gas precinct, in Australia, which has been, and they have been actually fracturing out there and for a long time, where Santos, has the Moomba plant and so forth. We do have shale out there, but so far what's been developed in on the east coast of Australia is coal seam gas, and obviously we've got a lot of coal, and the gas has always been there. It's just that now we know how to get it out. I did want to say, just as a big picture thing in terms of energy and climate, that there is a lot of pluses to having a gas boom, particularly if we're going to see demand for coal decline, and that is obviously one of our top exports. Below iron ore, it's probably, if you put thermal and coking coal together, it's probably our second biggest export, and Australia, if it's not going to be so coal dependent, does need new sources of revenue, and there is a climate benefit if it's done properly to using gas compared to coal. There's no question about that. There's also no question that if you do unconventional oil and gas badly, you lose that climate benefit very easily, and I'll come to that. So Queensland's looking at a situation where they've got, over the next 10 to 15 years, as a result of the 3 big projects that have already been approved, something like 20 to 30,000 wells that are going to be drilled across the Surat Basin, and that takes in the Darling Downs, and that isn't that is which you would hear on Alan Jones every other day. That's a disaster for the Darling Downs in terms of, for many of the farmers up there. On the other hand, they've probably had, they've definitely had some kind of economic, kick out of it. There's lots of jobs, and as I say, when demand for coal comes off, they will probably be glad to have those projects, generating income. I mean, we haven't even seen the income that they are going to get yet. Once those, the $60 billion capital spend is enormous, but once the machines are up and running, they generate, for the companies that own them, an incredible amount of profit, and therefore also, there's a royalty and there's a tax benefit for the state of Queensland, and also for, the country nationally. So I just might try, because I don't want to, tell me if I'm waffling, but basically, if I just go over quickly the issues that that this new fracking and coal seam gas, unconventional, oil and gas raises. First of all, the really hot button issue for a lot of farmers in particular is groundwater, and because you've got to pretty much drill through, you're going to be drilling through the beneficial aquifers that are pretty shallow, and there's all kinds of risks with the drilling. If that's not done right, you're using lots of different chemicals in your frack fluid to lubricate the drill string, and make sure that prop open the little fractures in the coal seam to make sure the gas comes out. And so there's lots of chemicals involved there. But the other issue is that just from the amount of water that you take out of the coal seam, that you can you change the sort of pressure gradients underground in ways that the frackers just can't always predict. And so there's all kinds of fears about connecting what is generally the coal seam's pretty salty, you know, are you going to induce somehow connections between the salty, you know, underlying aquifers and the fresher overlying aquifers? You know, that's a problem. The other problem is just by taking the water out, you reduce the pressure. People have got bores that tap into these beneficial aquifers, and then the pressure's gone or the level drops. You know, can they use that bore? And some farmers, you know, one I interviewed was the chairman of Grain Corp, Don Taylor, and he's out, you know, near Goondiwindi, and he's got his whole farm, you know, 4,000 head of cattle depends on that one bore, and it's about 1 kilometre deep. But he's, you know, with a whole lot of gas development to the east of him, his comments to me as well, if that, you know, if that bore fails, there's my property. So there's my 4,000 head of cattle. The stakes are very, very high for, you know, the farmers dependent on, particularly, you know, the Great Artesian Basin. There's been a lot of modelling to look at what are the levels of drawdown that will result from 20,000 wells, and you know, the truth is we're sort of in uncharted water. But anyway, that's Queensland, because they've sort of made their bed now that they're going to, I mean, obviously the Great Artesian Basin is a national resource, and you know, I think the federal government's just abolished the National Water Commission, so, and they were sounding the alarm, so you won't hear much more from that one. But it is a grave concern. Secondly, the climate, I mentioned, you know, that there is a benefit, you know, of switching from coal to gas. If you do a comparison, you know, from conventional, you're getting, I don't know, a 30 to 50% saving in terms of greenhouse gas emissions intensity by moving, you know, from coal to gas. But you lose some of that when you start to use unconventional oil and gas techniques, because there's so many wells. You know, it's a different model with offshore. You know, offshore gas, you're hitting reservoirs that, well, they're called gushers. Whereas when I first got introduced to the term coal seam gas, it was called girly gas, because, you know, they're just lots of little wells that just kind of give off a little bit of gas. Anyway, that stuck with me. But yeah, the truth is you've got to do 30,000 of these wells. Now, controlling fugitive emissions from 30,000 wells, which are all connected by pipeline and, you know, gathering lines, and you know, then you've got compression, and ultimately you've got to get that gas all the way to Gladstone. You know, there's huge potential for leaks, and the industry had, certainly in its early days, not a great track record for caring about fugitive emissions and monitoring these things and maintaining the well heads and so forth. And we've had studies done where, I think it was Southern Cross University, researchers drove through the gas fields in Queensland and measured the background ambient just with a little something on the back of the car, just picking up basically ambient you know, methane levels, and as they drove, you know, past wells, clearly these rose. And the industry absolutely panicked when that came out, and Martin Ferguson said, "Oh my God, it's not peer reviewed, you know, yet." And you know, they tried to shoot that research down, because it only takes methane is such an intense greenhouse gas. It only takes a leak of, you know, 1 to 2% of lifetime production of the well to completely undermine the climate benefit that you're getting by switching from coal to gas. And the other thing that we've seen, quite apart from fugitive emissions, is migratory emissions, where you know, gas underground, if you've actually fractured, and we've seen this in the Condamine River up in Queensland, if you fracture, you know, you do induce this connection, or you've got some gas escaping. What they've got there in the Condamine, and it's been happening for years, and as far as I know, it hasn't stopped. In fact, I'm sure it hasn't stopped, because how are they going to stop it? They've cracked the riverbed, and there's gas bubbling up through the river. Now, if you actually were counting, which I'm sure nobody is, if you were counting the amount of methane coming out of there, you know, it's obviously, it's a serious. I think it was Gavin Mudd was the hydrogeologist who the piece I read, which said, well, there you go, there goes your climate benefit right there if you've got gas bubbling away through the riverbed for, you know, X years. And they can't always control the consequences of a frack, and that's partly, I think, why the industry is quite still remains, even despite years of campaigning, they still can't be transparent. No journalist, for example, has gone and done a frack, or seen a frack. I mean, I would have pressed the button if they gave me the chance, and but not invited, absolutely not, and because they never know when something's going to go wrong, So 2 minutes. Okay, I'll race through. Salt. There's a great big background briefing coming on that because I've been talking to the reporter Jess Hill, and it's hilarious. It's sort of like nuclear waste, like they keep saying, oh yeah, we'll deal with that, and actually there's no answer for what you do with, you bring up all this salty water, you desalinate it, and then what do you do with the salt? And they've been saying for a decade. And okay, then they're going to put in the commercial market. No, because there's millions of tons of it. Nobody wants millions of tons of salt. And then the biggest issue of all is the land use. Well, I think the biggest issue in terms of why coal seam gas really struggles to find acceptance is land use conflict. For the people that I spoke to who were looking at the prospect of a network of wells rolling across their property, it was simply incompatible, particularly you got cropping, you got fertile black soil, but simply incompatible with the way they used their land and the way it had always been used and the way they wanted to farm it. And whether it's compaction, these deep, floodplain soils that, the farmers have got satellite, guided tractors to make sure within an inch of that their tyre tracks aren't, compacting too much, and then you've got to somehow across that lay some pipe for gathering, and you've got to store water, salty water, and you've got to have trucks coming and going, and somehow you've got to produce a crop in the middle of it. And most of the farmers, to a man or woman, just were going, no, what? No amount of money is going to make a difference if I'm going to stay here. So I think, and I'll just be, 30 seconds as to why that proposition of coal seam gas hasn't worked in New South Wales, and probably Jeremy's a much better person to talk about this anyway. But it does seem to me that they've really struggled here because A, it's, the land's worth more. B, I suppose we've suddenly had a chance to see what's going on in Queensland and appreciate the consequences. C, they've proposed, as one of the gentlemen I was just talking to earlier, they've come up with some pretty crazy proposals, the coal seam gas developers in New South Wales, like let's roll a coal seam gas field out in Camden into a subdivision, so we'll move north and the houses will come down this way and it will be a happy marriage in the middle. And no. Or what about, St Peters, we'll have a well there? No. What about, the middle of Byron Shire or where? No. So I did think that they were going to be in the middle of the Pilliga Forest. I thought, oh, they'll get away with that because no, the farmers on the Liverpool Plains didn't want it. But no, it seems that's struggling too, and I think that's partly because they've just played such a bad hand. They haven't been transparent, they haven't kept their word. They've had spills, they've had, and a great example, apart from what Jeremy's already released today, as I've just found out, but a great example is Santos arguing. We've got a gas supply crisis, we've got to get our Narrabri project fast-tracked. And when they get the 9-month fast-track promise from the state government, they fall over the very first hurdle. They can't even submit their environmental impact statement by their own deadline because they're not ready. It's just not, they just haven't, it's almost unprofessional. So anyway, that's enough from me. Thanks very much.